Welcome to a study of Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. Lesson 1. The historical background and structure of this letter. First section. Materials you will need to have available for this study. You'll need a copy of the NIV version of the New Testament. You will need a method to record notes you will keep as you proceed with this study. Most importantly, you will need a readiness to allow the text itself to guide you in all matters of faith and behavior. That is what it means to be biblical. That you do not allow theories, philosophies, schools of theology to determine what you believe and practice, but you allow the interpretation of the actual text of the New Testament. The two kinds of letters that were used in first century Roman Empire. There were private letters. The inhabitants of the Roman Empire were great letter writers. Their geographical mobility was the major causative factor in this outpouring. Remember, they had no newspapers, no radio stations, no public means of communicating from one person to another. So they used letters, and they refined those letters so that they would accomplish their purposes. Fortunately, we have hundreds, if not thousands, of ordinary people's letters. They were used as stuffing for animal mummies in the bone-dry delta region north of Alexandria, Egypt. This lets us know how private letters were structured at the time. Then there were public or literary letters in the Roman Empire of the first century. The intellectual leaders of the time carefully crafted these letters to present their ideas to a wider readership, just as with their friends. The letter was for material that would ordinarily today be included in magazine articles or journal articles. Not long enough for a book, which was very expensive to publish and distribute, but would contain important material anyway. Such letters were in no way spontaneous or occasional writings. They were intended to make known to a wider readership, and most of them were intended by their authors to be distributed to a general audience. Now, there was differences between the two kinds of letters. Private letters. While private letters often alluded to public affairs, politics or personal philosophy and so forth, they dealt mainly with matters of interest only to the two persons or the extended families of the two persons involved. Public letters, on the other hand, contained little or no personal references and dealt almost exclusively with matters of wider concern. All of Paul's letters dealt in varying degrees with both kinds of material. He seems to be the inventor of the hybrid personal private letter. I say seems to be because there are no other earlier examples than his. And after he wrote his personal private and public letters, it became the way of choice of distributing Christian material until it became so popular that people forgot that Paul had invented it. He used his letters to communicate and interpret the gospel message concerning the person, identity, and teachings of Christ. He also used his letters to apply these things to the solutions of personal, political, and social problems his converts faced when they turned from idols to a living God. These new believers had no guidelines or role models among their unbelieving family or circle of friends. This led to divisions, unchristian behavior, and intellectual and theological confusion that Paul used his letters to correct. The first century letter, whether it was public or private, had a basic structure. Note, I use the word letter for both public and private because the older usage of calling public letters epistles and letters for private ones is artificial and not useful. The first section of the letter was the salutation and formal greetings. The first word in a first century letter was always the name of the author. I've always thought that was more rational than our way of writing letters, where you have to go to the last page to see who it's from. When Paul wrote a letter, the first word in it was Paul. This was very often followed by a statement which further identified the author and clarified the author's relationship with his readers. Notice I say author and not writer, because most authors of public letters hired a professional writer to write the letter in a more legible and correct form. We know that this small places of exception was Paul's custom because we have the names. For instance, the man who authored Paul's letter to the Romans was named Tertius, for he says, I, Tertius, also send my greetings. Then there was the body of the letter. The main part of the letter, both public and private, was always introduced by one of two formulae. Thanksgiving to a deity for the recipient or recipients, and calling for that deity to bless the recipient or recipients. This was followed by a carefully prepared case for whatever the author wanted their reader or readers to know or to do. The way the material was presented was always influenced by one or more of the systems of rhetoric used in the first century. The influence of one or more systems of first century rhetoric can be seen in the letters of Paul. The final element in a private letter was a formulaic greeting to personal friends and relatives. Adding these to a public letter was Paul's creative addition to the art of letter writing. Now, the structure of Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 1, verses 1 through 9. Salutation. Paul identifies himself as an apostle of Christ and emphasizes that his apostleship depended on God and not any human agency. He shares the authorship of the letter with Sosthenes, one of his many young disciples. He names the assembly of believers in the Roman colony of Corinth as his target audience for the letter. This is important for two reasons. Being a Roman military colony meant that the social structure in Corinth was patterned on that of the military structure of the Roman Empire. This was especially true of the basic structure, which, as we shall see, plays an important role in causing the divisions that plague the church. By the extended identification of the assembly as holy and as a part of the universal assembly of believers in the Roman Empire, Paul begins helping the believers in Corinth to understand that their changed status in the world and their calling to be the covenant people of God was more important than their social, economic, or political status. He begins the body of the letter with the thanksgiving formula. He then rather abruptly introduces his treatment of the first problem that he finds in the Corinthian assembly of believers. Goodbye and congratulations on your desire to study Paul's first letter to the Corinthian church.